Hello there, welcome to Turk Talks. Did you know that the Clone Wars is actually an allegory for the American Civil War? Up next on Turk Talks. So, today what we are going to be discussing is, like I mentioned in the intro, the Clone Wars being an allegory for the American Civil War. What this means is we are specifically talking about Star Wars, the Clone Wars, the conflict that happens in Star Wars lore from 22 BBY to 19 BBY. And for those of you who don't know what BBY means, it means before Battle of Yavin, because Yavin, which is the final battle of Episode 4 when the Death Star blows up, is considered to be 0 year for the Star Wars timeline. Subscribe if you want me to talk about just the Star Wars timeline in and of itself. That'd be a massive episode. We'll see. Maybe it's a series. We'll talk about it, but let me know. Let me know what you guys think. I'm going to give you 5 reasons why I think the Clone Wars is an allegory for the American Civil War. Starting off with number 1. The conflict is very similar. The idea of the Confederacy of Independent Systems leaving the Galactic Republic because they felt that their rights weren't represented, and they also felt like the Galactic Republic was corrupt and they wanted to leave to form their own nation, their own galaxy, their own coalition themselves, is very similar to the Confederate States of America leaving the Union, the United States of America, because they believed that they were not being represented fairly in the Senate and House of Representatives, just like the Confederacy of Independent Systems felt like they weren't being treated fairly by the Galactic Republic. Now, massive disclaimer here. The rest of the reasons that we're going to get into will reveal why the Confederacy is still bad. I'm not saying they had a legitimate claim for leaving the Republic. It wasn't actually the Confederacy of Independent Systems Parliament or Senate that was making a lot of the decisions. It was the CIS Council, which is a very different and bad group of people. Namely, Count Dooku, Newt Gunray, Wat Tambor, the leader of the banking clan, the Commerce Guild as well. They were not good people. The CIS wasn't really good, and neither was the Confederate States of America on that matter, because they claimed that they were fighting for states' rights, right? A state's right to what? Yeah, think about that. Anyway, so since I've been talking about the Confederacy of Independent Systems and the Confederate States of America, that brings me to my second point, which is the similarities between the names of the factions that are involved. On the one side, you have the Grand Army of the Republic, and on the other side, you have the Confederacy of Independent Systems. So you have the GAR and the CIS. Now, if you are a bit of a history buff like I am, the GAR should sound similar, especially if you study the American Civil War, because that is in fact what the Union's military was called, the Grand Army of the Republic. And you know what? CIS sounds very similar to CSA, Confederate States of America, Confederacy of Independent Systems. So therein is my second point of evidence. You have very similar names between the real-world counterparts and also the Star Wars lore names being the same in one case and also very similar in the other case. This is where it gets interesting. As we see in Season 3, Episode 10 of The Clone Wars, Heroes on Both Sides, Ahsoka and Padme go and visit the CIS Parliament, also known as the CIS Senate. But when you look at the way that the building is structured and the way that it looks on Raxus Secundus, which is the planet that is the capital of the CIS, it looks a lot like British Parliament. And this is an interesting note because it is a well-known fact The Confederate States of America got help from the British. They sent them cannon. They also sent a couple of advisors over to the South as well, because the South had a connection to the British via cotton. That was their trade. They would supply England with cotton, and it was cheap, and it was their main export. And so England felt like they could kind of help out the South because they had this good relationship with them. And that's why I think Dave Filoni was very, very poignant in choosing the British parliamentary building as inspiration for the CIS Parliament. I know what you're thinking. That might be a bit of a stretch, but there's something to it, and this is my third reason. You had the American Senate, which is obviously what the Senate is referencing to in Star Wars. It's also referencing the Roman Senate. Chancellor Palpatine becomes Emperor Palpatine. There's a big correlation between him and Julius Caesar and Hitler. That's a video for another time, perhaps, unless we get on a tangent in this one, but I think we'll keep it straight. Subscribe if you want to see more videos like this one. But you have the American Senate, House of Representatives. The way that the Senate building looks in Star Wars is reminiscent of the American Congress building, with the more round structure of it compared to the Parliament that we saw in that episode of the Clone Wars, which is clearly based off of the British Parliament. Who is the head of the CIS Parliament, the CIS Senate? Oh yeah, Count Dooku. Which brings me to my fourth point. Count Dooku looks a lot like Robert E. Lee. Yes, obviously, Sir Christopher Lee is the individual who played Count Dooku, and there are similarities in how they look just based off of their look, but even if you look at the costume and the hairstyle and the beard, they look very similar. And it's also interesting that Count Dooku is the head of state for the CIS, is very much a figurehead, and is very much a poster boy for the CIS as well, which was a very similar role that Robert E. Lee had for the Confederates in the South. He was a figurehead and also a poster boy for the South. In fact, the flag that everybody calls the Confederate flag was not actually the flag for the Confederate States of America. It's Robert E. Lee's battle flag. Based on this conclusion that Count Dooku kind of looks like Robert E. Lee and also has a similar role that was fulfilled by Robert E. Lee, leads me to believe that the Clone Wars is definitely an allegory for the American Civil War. Here's the kicker. This is my fifth reason. The CIS owned slaves. As we know from Season 4, Episode 12 of The Clone Wars, Slaves of the Republic, Anakin, Ahsoka, Obi-Wan, and Rex went on a mission to Zygerria, which is a planet that made a deal with Count Dooku himself and the CIS. That planet and that empire is a slave planet and a slave empire. I was already pretty convinced by these other points that I stumbled upon when I was, just 12 years old. But when this episode of The Clone Wars came out, pretty much clinched it for me. Obviously, what I was alluding to earlier with the states' right to what line is that the Confederate States of America owned slaves. They owned people, which is not okay by a lot of standards. That is what they were fighting for. They were fighting to keep their way of life, which was built on the backs of slaves. It's very clear to me that the writers of the Clone Wars, including Dave Filoni and George Lucas, were very poignant with adding the Zygerrian slave empire into the mix of the Clone Wars, which kind of solidifies the argument that CIS really does represent the CSA. They had very similar reasons for leaving the Galactic Republic, just like the CSA left the United States. They also had similar names for their factions, the Grand Army of the Republic and the Confederacy of Independent Systems. Their Parliament building is based off of the British Parliament building, and we know that the British had a connection to the South Count Dooku looks like Robert E. Lee and fulfills a similar role to Robert E. Lee. And finally, CIS owned slaves. Which, of course, Anakin did not take too kindly to, and he ended up killing a lot of slavers in that arc. And, it's small victories for future Darth Vader. I mean, let's not talk about him, like, force-choking Poggle the Lesser and then just casually not telling the council about it. Even though they already probably knew what he was doing. But, I'm not saying Anakin is much better at this point. But, at least he was fighting for the right reasons. I hope you guys liked this episode, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. Seriously, let me know what you think down in the comments. I want to know if any of you came to this conclusion like I did. I remember when I was 12, when I was first searching for somebody else who maybe had this idea, I found like one random forum on the internet where somebody had posed the same question, like, these are kind of similar, I think the Clone Wars is an allegory for the American Civil War. But yeah, let me know if you guys had similar thoughts, and if you have any other thoughts about this episode, we'd love to interact with you guys. So, slavery is terrible, droids suck, and clones are the best. As always, you got the makings of greatness in you.